In the week in which Boris Johnson showed Britain what freedom could look like, a small bunch of game developers made Vikings cool again, and Daft Punk announced that they were returning to their home planet, what more could you need than two blokes just talking about films for an hour?
Oh, that's a good one.
Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Rip Ticket Review, where we review old movies and TV shows and talk about them for an hour. My name is Mr. Carver, and joining me is my Marty to, if I'm Doc, I guess, TheJackSmit himself. Great Scott Smith.
That's literally what I wrote as well. Hello and welcome to the Rip Ticket Review, wherever you're listening or watching. And if it's not obvious enough, we're talking about the greatest trilogy, well, one of the greatest trilogies ever made, because we've been talking off air about the trilogy we're going to talk about next week. But this week we're talking all things Back to the Future, all three parts, because it was on the list for the films that reopened cinemas last time round. I mean, we've talked about road maps, because where we're going, we don't need roads.
No.
Yeah, so before we launch into the three films, it's important to note that these films are 30 years old now, and it doesn't feel like they've aged that much.
No. They're a part of a film category where they are timeless classics. There's certain films which are really, really great, but they've aged. Like Citizen Kane, for example. Yeah. Is an example of a great movie, has aged like warm milk. What else have we got here as well? Attack of the Titans, Clash of the Titans, maybe, is another one. Great film, has aged pretty badly in terms of effects. Back to the Future, complete opposite. Great film. Yes, all right. There are some bits where you know the hairstyles and the fashion. It's in the 80s. Who cares? It's still great. It's like Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, RoboCop. It's one of the original Back to the Future is one of those movies that just it doesn't. You can watch it now and you'd find it just as entertaining, if not more so, than had you watched it in 1985. It's brilliant. Yeah, and it's a very difficult thing to do. It is a very difficult thing to do, and importantly, we've something like this particular show setting off a new generation on their journeys into an outstanding franchise. I feel like we're the torchbearers of good cinema with this episode today. Well, we've talked about some good, some bad, but we get to talk about some really good films now. And so let's start right back at the very start. 1985, big year for cinema. UK admissions were at their all-time lowest of 54 million, although, let's be honest, last year was officially the proper all-time lowest. And then this film comes out of nowhere and reignites audiences' love for science fiction. Steven Spielberg was involved, Robert Zemeckis was involved, Bob Gale wrote the script. Yeah. But it's a relatively basic film if you think about it. In the year 1985, Marty McFly assists a local nutty scientist by the name of Dr. Emmett Brown with experiments just near a Burger King restaurant. This gives you an idea of your setting. When a clock experiment goes wrong and he realises that he's 25 minutes late for school, he suffers humiliation. His family are at war with each other. His mum's overweight, an alcoholic. His dad is being bullied at the hands of one Biff Tannen, a character we get to know quite a lot over the trilogy. And his hot date goes down the pan when, of course, Biff Tannen crashes his dad's car. And it's at this point where we start to meet one of the most iconic characters in the film. We've got to really fly through it because we've got 3 films to cover. It's at this point where we meet Doc Brown for the first time with one of the most iconic moments in cinema where we get to see the creation of a time machine out of a DeLorean. That is a unique enough premise as it is. Yeah, this did so much for the DeLorean brand, which I suppose I should be thankful for because the DeLorean was a terrible car. Yeah, it was a very bad car. It was a very bad car, and I think the only thing good about it you could say is, oh, it's a car from Back to the Future. So yeah, it was. Again, it's iconic. It's a cinema example of iconography in cinema that you can put in front of someone, and they'd be like, oh yeah, it's Back to the Future.
Yeah.
Again, very difficult to do.
Very difficult to do,
Well,
especially in the 80s when people like opening arms like, oh, is this home video the death of cinema? Then you have original IP like this coming out, taking influences from Jules Verne Time Machine books, which I like the fact they reference Jules Verne later on in the trilogy. That is a nice touch. So we see the Time Machine for the first time, and again, of its time, powered by plutonium to get the 1.21 gigawatts of power needed to power the thing. First quote of the film. But they actually bring in, harsh to say, but they bring in a theme of terrorism because they bring in Libyans as the whole plot device to bring in terms of this is who Doc's stealing from to get the power for the car. Very evocative of its time. And even then, that plot point hasn't dated that badly because it feels stereotypically Back to the Future. And not many people really complain about it.
No, it wasn't done. The Libyan terrorists weren't portrayed in a disrespectfully racist light. They were terrorists from Libya.
Yeah, they were terrorists from Libya, just here to get the plutonium. That's it. But
well, they were there, yeah, because and the thing is, they weren't there for no reason. Doc sells them a dodgy bomb. He claims it's a plutonium bomb. In the novels, it's revealed that he filled it with the bomb full of old pinball parts. I can't remember if that's in the future or not. But in the novel, he goes a step further, as novels do, and says, no, that it wasn't a plutonium bomb. I just filled it full of old pinball machine parts.
Oh,
and just sold it to them. And that's why they came to shoot him.
Such a Doc Brown way of dealing with things.
Pretty much, yeah. So it wasn't done in a case of, a stereotypical racists or Libyan terrorists. It was no, the terrorists had a reason to be there.
Yeah, but it's in this sequence we see the DeLorean do its thing for the first time. We see that flux capacitor fluxing. We see it go to 88, and the car with Einstein the dog in it travels about 2 minutes into the future. The Libyans happen. Marty gets in it, makes an escape. We go back in time 30 years, and one of the things that to 1955. One of the things that influenced the production of the film in this way is they wanted to go back in time. To a point where it was still relatively recent in audiences' minds, but still far enough to make it feel authentic. They toyed back with going to the 40s. They realised that wouldn't work because war. And then Bob Gale settled on 1955 because it was still recent enough. They could get licensing for the songs that they wanted to use, and importantly, they could turn that Hill Valley set at Universal into a really authentic depiction of what a typical American town was like back then. And I like the fact that they use the same set for all three parts, and it's still at Universal Studios to this day. The clock tower is still there.
Blimey.
And they still film
That's
it.
amazing.
I remember they filmed a couple of episodes of Desperate Housewives on that set many years ago. They still use it for active shooting, which I find it's on a studio tour and everything. That's how iconic this film is.
Yeah, it's extreme. Yeah, it's got its place now, hasn't it? The whole set is a part of movie history, especially since the clock tower figures into the plot. But yeah, Marty travels back to 1955, and in a chance encounter, he runs into his father and interrupts the meeting between his father and his mother. His mother explains, "Oh, George fell out of a tree watching birds." yeah, birds. George is obviously northerner, and it turns out that he was watching a bird. That's for
but
sure.
not the kind of bird that we thought he was watching.
No. He was watching his mother as a child, basically being a peeping tom. And Marty interrupts the meeting, and to his horror, Marty, after he this obviously sets off a chain reaction of events unbeknownst to Marty, when Marty seeks out the help of Doc Brown in 1955, who in order to get back. And Doc Brown, after Mike convinces him that he's legit, Doc Brown reveals actually by interrupting his parents' first meeting, Marty has essentially written himself out of existence
and disrupting a space-time continuum. Yeah.
Exactly. So he's written himself out of existence, as evidenced by that family photo that Marty carries around. And so the entire plot.
That's a key plot point that we explore a little bit later on as well.
Yep. So the essential plot of the movie is Marty has to get his parents to meet again, whilst trying to get back to 1955 using powering the DeLorean using the storm, isn't it?
Using the lightning strike at the clock tower on November 12th, 1955 at 10:04 p.m. Oh, I didn't even need to look at my notes for that.
1.21 gigawatts.
Yes.
So it is a brilliant movie. It's a simple plot. I mean, the best plots are the ones that you have in one sentence.
Yeah.
Boy travels back in time, interrupts parents' meeting, has to fix it before he goes back.
And there are added complications in that when Marty meets his future mum for the first time, she gets a bit of a crush on him and flirts rather outrageously for a film released in 1985. She calls him Calvin Klein at first because it's written on his pants, and then the truth eventually comes out.
Well, I think. Well, I don't think they.
Well, the truth plays out over the 30 years in between him interfering.
I don't think he tells her for good reason, very good reason, because it would have been weird and he would have been locked up in a mental asylum. But it was such a great movie, Back to the Future. I'm remembering it. I had the novels as well because I got them. I don't know where did I find the novels. This was years back though. This was when I was a kid learning to read. So, it's a brilliant movie on its own.
Yep.
Of course, starring Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd, two titans in this movie. I mean, this is them at the height of their career.
Indeed, it is. It wasn't originally meant to be Michael J. Fox. I had another guy audition for the Marty role, but he had to step away because J. Fox was the first choice, but he was working on an NBC sitcom, and they were unsure as to whether he could balance I think it was called Family. It was working on Family Ties, yes. So he was unsure whether he could work on Family Ties and Back to the Future at the same time because it was really late shoots on Back to the Future, especially the first half of the film is majority of it shot at night. So they were unsure as to whether he could do the sitcom and Back to the Future, and they shot. You built a time machine out of a DeLorean sequence with the other guy, and I can't remember his name, Eric Stender, something like that. They shot that whole sequence with him, and then they realised it just wasn't working, so they paid Michael J. Fox a serious amount of money, and then little did they know he would be the right Marty for the job, because if you think about it, is there anyone other than Michael J. Fox who could make it work at that age? Sort of make the Marty role come alive.
No, and it's got to the point now where the director of this is a firm believer of that fact that he's ensured that there is to be no remake made, because it's like recasting Mark Hamill as Luke Skywalker.
Yes.
You just can't see anyone else in that role at all. It's the whole entire reason why that plot twist happened in The Mandalorian. Actually, do you know, it's been enough time now. If you haven't seen it, you've obviously, but it's one of the reasons why they essentially made the entire new Star Wars trilogy again, because they needed to bring back all the old characters in some way, shape, or form. I can't, so Michael J. Fox is, again, it's one of those roles where you just can't see anyone else doing the role.
Yeah, especially the stunt work as well, because the next bit that we get to after the whole plan being set afoot, we get to see the first of many skateboard chases around Hill Valley. And that's one of the best, for me, that is one of the best moments of the film, because it's a theme that comes back throughout the trilogy, that you get beat-for-beat recreations of this scene. Because the way it was shot, the way it was cut, the way the music comes in, because Alan Silvestri did the score for all three, and I can't fault Alan Silvestri at all, because he is an absolute god amongst composers in Hollywood. The fact that they got him to do the Avengers theme speaks a lot. But we get the whole Marty trying to convince Lorraine to go to the Enchantment Under the Sea dance, which is ultimately where they'd meet, they'd fall in love. George is a bit of a wuss. He's a bit too nervous to get the job done. So
reminds me of me. And I was that age. Really, really
So
honest.
enter a young Biff Tannen. We've seen his older self in 1985, and it's Thomas F. Wilson who plays him in all forms, whether it's prosthetic or with heavy moustache in part 3. So Biff Tannen walks in. He's bullying George back in the day as well. He harasses him out of jealousy over Lorraine. So Marty stands up to him. Lorraine falls in love right there after Biff is forced into a truck full of horse manure. Because I hate horse manure.
Because well, him and Marty ends up befriending his future father and attempts to sort of like get him to meet, but then he tries to sort of say, look, you've got to, be brave, and you've got to, I don't want to say man up, but that's kind of what he says. I'm not a massive fan of that term, but hey, it was the 80s. Back then we weren't so on top of language like that. But yeah, he's like saying, you've got to, stand up. And he does this thing as well where he, Marty ends up invading Biff's house at night as this sort of pretending to be an alien from outer space.
Oh yeah, like the invasion of George's house in a hazmat suit. I am Darth Vader from the planet Ultron. And the Van Halen cassette.
Throwing at us all of these pop culture references in a way that hasn't been done since. And, George McFly ends up standing up for himself and socking Biff in the jaw with a beautiful straight punch. And that's, of course, what fixes everything. And it fixes everything for the better, because when Marty ends up going back, he realizes his life has improved in several ways. His father is a very successful science fiction author in the sort of sense of Kurt Vonnegut's sort of style way of things. His mother is doing very well. And most importantly, Biff has sort of learned to shut the hell up from time to time and not be a grade A-hole, which is brilliant.
And then we reach the end of the film. Everything is all well and good. They're successfully able to ride the lightning back up to 1985. But one of the things that really differed between part 1 and part 2 is they did a slight recast for part 2. Because you watch the end of part 1 and you see Marty with his girlfriend Jennifer, who's played by Claudia Wells. Skip forward 3 years, Jennifer looks a lot more like Ali with an I, because Elizabeth Shue comes on board to play the role for part 2 onwards.
Now, because before we go on to part 2, I think it's important to say something, that nobody expected this film, part 1, Back to the Future, to do as well as it did. That's why it's just called Back to the Future, not Back to the Future Part 1. And if the film ended there and that was it, we'd still be satisfied. Yeah, I think it would all be hunky dory.
As a one and done, it works so well.
It worked very, very well. It's a brilliant self-concluding story. And when you think about it, it's the most basic of time travel plots.
Yeah.
It doesn't get much simpler than this. It's the grandmother. It's kind of a different sort of take on the grandmother paradox, isn't it? Where if you go back in time and shoot your own grandmother, that means you won't be born. That means you won't be born. But if you're not born, then what happens? And it's kind of an interesting sort of take on that. But time travel rules themselves, it seems, they don't follow. They sort of follow the Terminator rules, I guess, where if you change something in the past, it immediately has an effect into the future.
Yeah, the photograph is a key example of that. So as he's playing Earth Angel, he's disappearing from the photo again. When George and Lorraine get together and Johnny B. Good starts blurring out, the finger reappears, the photo returns to normal. That's one of the things I loved about part 1, is the fact that every action had its consequences and the little hints to the fact that he's from the future. It's like, oh yeah, I've seen this episode already, but it's brand new. How? Reruns. You'll learn about it.
And the thing is, both these main characters of Marty McFly and Doc Emmett, they work on such a great level. They really do. The chemistry there is brilliant. We don't care why Marty's hanging out with this creepy old Doc. We don't care at all, because he's such a friendly guy. Why, we don't. It doesn't. We don't need to know. It's one of those things where you never even think about it, because the actors are elevating this to such levels. You've also got as well the actors and actresses who are playing Marty's parents. Brilliant. I think one of the best things that really helps this movie is that everyone is playing the same character,
Yeah.
regardless of what time period that we're in. That really helps because if you had someone else playing like Kid George McFly, I don't think it would have been easier to connect with the character.
Yeah, literally everyone keeps their roles with the exception of Marty's girlfriend,
Yeah.
and that was due to personal reasons more than anything.
Yeah. And the thing is, as well, it's okay. So we can obviously Michael J. Fox is playing the quintessential cool '80s kid. You know, he's wearing the latest hip clothes. He's got the electric guitar. He's got the cool car that can travel back in time. And then you've got Doc Brown, who is the quintessential mad scientist, essentially friendly guy. And obviously, these two characters are the extreme, almost at the extreme of their archetypes. But what makes this so brilliant is that the other characters, supporting characters, you can identify with these characters.
Yep.
In some way, shape, or form. You can still identify with them. You know, the male, the identifiable males of the audience can, you know, look at George McFly and think to themselves, "Oh yeah, I remember a time when I wanted to ask someone out and I was too shy."
And everyone knows a Biff Tannen.
Everyone knows a Biff Tannen, unfortunately, and. Who, you know, those who identify as female can look at, you know, it doesn't even need to be a gender thing, does it? Because, you know, it could be swapped easily enough. You know, but everyone can look at that the character of Mai's mum and sort of see, oh yeah, the preppy girl, I remember when I used to be that popular or something along those lines. And you can identify with these characters. They're not far out of reach. It's brilliant storytelling. It really is. And the soundtrack. Oh, the soundtrack is brilliant.
Huey Lewis and the News got their big break thanks to that. Yep. Those two songs. Power of Love in the first act, and then you hear Back in Time over the end credits. Oh.
Huey Lewis and the News, an already great band from the classic rock, given a career boost. I mean, it's just fantastic stuff. And it's a brilliant film. It's kid-friendly as well. It's one of those films where you can watch it at any age and love it.
I mean, the BBFC agree with you. It's a PG nowadays, even though there are elements that are a bit raunchy for a PG by the current standard. It is still PG to this day. But I can literally prove it because I've got my copy of the Blu-ray up here. Because I've got the film, I've got the box set twice for some bizarre reason. I bought it on DVD years back, and then I bought the 30th anniversary Blu-ray when they brought that out, just because I wanted it on Blu-ray.
Fair enough. I mean, you know, why wouldn't you? It's a great movie.
5 once around. That's another perk.
Yeah. And so Back to the Future, it was a brilliant movie. It really reinvigorated the cinema. It's considered to be one of the greatest films of the 1980s, one of the best science fiction films ever made, one of the greatest films of all time. Library of Congress in 2007 selected the film for preservation in the National Film Registry. It launched 2 sequels. It was made for a budget of $19 million, and it made over $300 million. It was inevitable that a sequel was going to happen. And here's the thing about the sequels of Back to the Future. They're not bad.
I know. That's one of the things that with these franchises, you've got that extra pressure of making a sequel that is a worthy successor, let alone making 2 sequels that are worthy successors. And we've talked about many franchises over the last couple of weeks here on Rope Ticket. We've talked about Karate Kid. We've talked about RoboCop. We've talked about Alien last series and how all of that franchise has played out. But with Back to the Future, these films, they just seem to add more and more, and they still do not compromise on quality, even though we enter the realms of going into what a 1980s depiction of 2015 would look like.
Yeah, which is about as amazing as it sounds, trust me. But one of the things as well, the thing about trilogies is that they sort of follow the sort of same path in that you have your characters in the first film and you have to build them up, and, you know, they have their conflict and they win and they become better for it. And then in the second movie, you're very familiar with the characters and they have the greater conflict and then they're better. And then in the third movie, that's where it normally all goes to pot, because it's like, well, you've had 2 adventures with them. What can you do? And there are many, many trilogies out there which follow that sort of same rule, don't they? The first one's good, the second one's brilliant, and the third one is just not as good. I mean, Indiana Jones is a great example of this. First one was great, second one was brilliant, and the third one is forgettable. And there's so many out there that, you know, I'm thinking about as well. The Dark Knight is a great example of the Dark Knight trilogy. Batman Begins, good. The Dark Knight, great. The Dark Knight Rises, I've watched it once. I don't need to watch it again.
Yeah.
Forgettable. Back to the Future is, in itself, one of the greatest movie trilogies out there.
Yeah.
It really is. It's up there with Star Wars in terms of the best. It's up there with Lord of the Rings in terms of one of the best movie trilogies out there. And it helps with the second movie. The second movie was released in let's have a quick look here. See, release date was 1985. Well, release date was 90. I've got. Oh no, that's. I'm looking at Back to the Future 1. Back to the Future 2. Yeah, you're right. Of course, you're right. It's 1989. Now, the important thing about this is that Back to the Future. They were so confident in their story that they filmed Back to the Future Part 2 and Part 3 back to back.
Which actually helped them a lot in the end, because it was around this time that Michael J. Fox unfortunately got his Parkinson's diagnosis, and he worked on these films while dealing with all of that and doing the stunt work that he has to do in Part 3, which we'll get on to. That makes this trilogy even more impressive.
It is. Now, it should be noted that when Back to the Future Part 2 was released, it did receive mixed reviews from critics. Some liked it, others didn't, but it has improved over time as we look back at it, and we realise now, with time, that it was actually one of Robert Zemeckis' best films that he's done.
Yeah.
Like, unquestionably, and it's one of the best sequels of all time.
I mean, I have my issues with Part 2, but it's still a cracking movie.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But yeah, I mean, so the film essentially takes place straight after the first one. Doc Brown...
We see a closing scene again, but with a little bit of a new perspective this time around. We see an old Biff Tannen seeing that time machine travel off to the future. We
do, yes. Biff Tannen, we sees the time machine. Meanwhile, Marty and his girlfriend Jennifer, played by Elizabeth Shue this time, and Doc Emmett Brown go to the future. There's an issue where Marty's children are going to end up in a sticky situation that Marty has to fix. And they do so, but they also discover a lot about their futures. Jennifer does. Jennifer discovers that Marty suffers an accident, and as a result, he resigns himself to a life in the future as essentially a desk jockey. Their life isn't too good at all. Their kids are essentially brats, and one of them also ends up in jail as well due to a bank robbery gone wrong. And it's very much down to they even get the facts from Marty's employer, future Marty's employer, who fires him for taking part in some kind of illegal financial scheme. And we obviously get a really big clue into Marty's personality when he does this, because he is called a chicken, which is one of the running jokes. Somebody calls Marty a chicken, and he's just like, "Oh right, yeah, no, it's on." They end up going back to the future, but before they do, Marty purchases a sports almanac, which was printed in the future and contains a list of all the sort of highlights and the wins.
The Grey Sporting Almanac 1950 to 2000.
Yep, which Marty comes up with an idea. He says, actually, I'm going to take it back to the present and I'm going to use it to make lots and lots of money. But Doc is like, no, Marty, you can't do that. It's irresponsible. It's wrong. It's not what the time machine was designed for. And so they throw it. But Biff, the elderly Biff, overhears all of this. He waits until the time machine is empty.
Yeah, because Doc ultimately makes Marty put the almanac in a bin.
Oh, yeah, he makes him put it back in the bin, doesn't he? But Biff gets it out, finds the time machine when it's unwatched, goes back in time, hands it to, and then comes back, and we don't know what he's done, except for that bit where I've just accidentally mentioned it. So, yeah, he doesn't. So we don't know what's happened, what the consequences are. until we go back to the present 1985, where Marty discovers to his absolute horror that Biff is essentially the undisputed ruler of the of his hometown.
Yep, alternate timeline, here we come.
Yep, and we get the alternate timeline story, which is a great time travel story.
Oh yeah,
where an event that happens in the past of something from the future influences the past, hits the present. In this case, Biff has used the almanac to take it back to his younger self, and his younger self has used the almanac to gain all these riches. He's got his own company now, and he's also married to Marty's mum. The shock and the horror. Marty, having realized what has happened, and after getting the answers from Biff, decides to take Doc and the time machine, and both of them go back to 1955 in order to undo the damage that Marty has inadvertently caused with his idea. It is a brilliant plot.
Yeah. What a twist. What a twist, because it takes you right back to the first one.
Yeah. Because it takes that theme that was put into the first one of you got to be careful about what you do because you don't want to change the past, and it asks what happens if you do, in the worst possible way. And it's Marty's nightmare. Biff himself, obviously, allegories have been made to Donald Trump.
Yeah, the influence is very clearly there.
Yeah, and it also is quite predictable as well about where America would end up, which is weird. But that's the best sci-fi movies aren't they? They make these sort of offhand comments and stuff, and then it turns out, oh yeah, they were right on the money.
Yeah.
So what makes this brilliant is that Robert Zemeckis said that a sequel was not planned for the first film. It was going to be a one and done. That's it. And then the box office came in. The funders were very happy.
Yeah, Universal were very happy with how it played out.
Universal were doing great, and they went and said to director Robert Zemeckis, we want another movie. And Zemeckis had one one condition, and he said only if Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd returned as well. And fortunately, they came back, and we got the sequel. This brilliant sequel. Now there was one regret that they ended the first one movie with Jennifer in the car because it required them to come up with a story that fit her in rather than a whole new adventure. I think the plan was if they were going to do a sequel, it would have been a completely whole new adventure, whole new day. Now, I think that this movie works because it continues on from the previous movie. I think a whole new adventure, I don't think that would have worked.
Yeah, picking up exactly where we left off. I mean, the Karate Kid did the exact same thing, continuing the story right off from the competition, and then continuing Miyagi and down the story further. I think what we're continuing one singular story over the three films. They might not be intrinsically the same plot, but they are cleverly linked together, where the events of the first film plays into the events of part 3, the events of part 2 become more evident in part 1, especially the back end of part 2, where we get to see a completely different perspective of that November 1955 sequence, where the one rule is that future Marty can't interfere with what past Marty is doing. They can't they can't touch each other, they can't even see each other, because if they do, that is the end of space-time continuum. Christopher Nolan did a plot similar to that in Tenet with the whole inversion thing. It's been out long enough I can start spoiling elements of that film now. So the influence of part 2 has had long-ranging effects on everywhere in Hollywood about how you can portray time within movies. Because that was the one thing I was thinking when I was watching Tenet. I was thinking, hang on, this reeks of Back to the Future Part 2 a little bit. The ending of Back to the Future Part 2, where he's trying to avoid reaching himself.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I really love about the sequel is the futuristic vision of the far future of 2015.
Yeah.
Now, the production designer, Rick Carter, he realized that the Blade Runner had essentially set the image for what future cities would look like.
Yeah.
Smoke, chrome, dull sort of film noir colors. And so Rick Carter, the production designer, wanted to move away from that. And he wanted to create something which sort of, it was a subversion of the normal science fiction trope of when we look into the future. Because when we look into the future, it's not, in a lot of science fiction, a lot of what goes wrong in the future is due to technology. I mean, heck, all you have to do is look at the Orwellian future seen in most science fictions.
Yes.
Where it's technology that's used to oppress people. And the things that we see in the future of 2015's Back to the Future is pretty pleasant. 3D movies, self-tying, self-drying shoes.
Pepsi Perfect is a thing as well. Other
Pepsi
soft drinks are
Perfect.
available.
Yep, in the future, that is. It's really... And it's one of the most noticeable things where actually what goes wrong isn't due to technology, it's just due to people's decisions. A lot of respect for that. It's nice, because the whole thing about sci-fi is it's meant to be this warning of things to come, isn't it? It's meant to be this sort of warning of what happens if we go down this road. Whereas with Back to the Future, it's like, yeah, the future can be great. People can still make mistakes, but that's not because of the future's fault. It's just because of people's decisions. I like that. Respect.
It's the way that Bob Gale wrote it, it was very ambiguous in the way it was all like set out, but watching it back all these years later, you can sort of see that he had some very good intention for how he deliberately wrote this film to make it so 2015 in his world is a very positive place. Little do we know what actual 2015 would play out like. Because I actually remember watching the whole trilogy on Back to the Future Day itself in 2015. I watched the whole lot on October 21st. Best 6 hours of my life ever.
Oh, bless.
But look, with part 2, having it play out and seeing the events of part 1 from a new perspective, this is a nice little part of the setup for part 3, in that it's a successful mission again. We get yet more events involving younger Biff. Marcy followed him to the school dance, took his precautions to avoid interrupting events. Eventually, Marcy gets the almanac back, stealing it from Biff's car using a hoverboard. Nice touch. Because, again, what would a Back to the Future film be without a bigger, better action scene involving some form of wheel or hover-based skateboard device?
Yep, and in the Back to the in the film's behind-the-scenes featurette, Zemeckis said that the hoverboards were real, yet not released to the public due to parents complaining about safety. And they were also on the DVD release of the trilogy in the extras. There is footage of quote-unquote real hoverboards. A lot of people thought that Zemeckis was telling the truth, and they were one of the most requested items in toy stores, despite not being real.
Why would they not? They're hoverboards. Every kid at that point in the 80s would want a hoverboard.
Oh, Zemeckis, you... What's he like, honestly? But, yeah.
But we get the hoverboard sequence. Biff tries to run down Marcy with a car. Hoverboard lifted into place. Doc lifts Marcy into safety with a DeLorean. And Biff, in his nice little 1950s car, once again ends up in a truck of horse manure.
Brilliant. Now, there are obviously a few things that were different. Claudia Wells is replaced with Elizabeth Shue. She had to turn it down to personal reasons. And so Elizabeth Shue was pulled. And then, of course, Crispin Glover, who played George McFly.
He didn't want to appear in this film, did he?
He did not want to appear in this film. He couldn't come to an agreement with the producers regarding his salary. And there was also a philosophical disagreement on the film's message. He felt that the characters were rewarded with financial gain, not with love. And that's why he didn't want to appear in the film. So Zemeckis used previously filmed footage of Glover from the first film, as well as a new footage of Jeffrey Wiseman, the actor who wore prosthetics, including a false chin, nose, and cheekbones to resemble Glover. However, this led to a lawsuit. Glover filed a lawsuit against the producers of the film because he claimed that they did not own his likeness, nor did they ask him permission to use it. As a result of this, there is now clauses in the Screen Actors Guild collective bargaining agreement stating that producers and actors are not allowed to use such methods to reproduce the likenesses of other actors.
Once again, making long-ranging change within Hollywood.
Indeed. And here's the thing, though. His legal action, even though it was resolved outside of the courts, it's been considered a key case in personality rights with actors, because there are now improved special effects, aren't there, in these films? You have deep fakes, which
the deep fakes. I know they use this sort of technology on Rogue One to bring back characters from the dead, and they also did something like that again at the end of Rogue One to make someone look a little bit more like Carrie Fisher for the end sequence of Rogue One. And we're seeing a lot more of that now in terms of digital recreations of actors for the purposes of resurrecting long gone talent.
Yeah, definitely. And it's still a key landmark case, the Crispin Glover case, that is used to settle these disputes where actors can have their likenesses being used, can't have their likenesses being used without their agreement. And like I said, Claudia Wells turned down the film for personal reasons, but don't worry, she had the opportunity to reprise her role from the first film 26 years later by providing the voice of Jennifer for Back to the Future, the game, by Telltale Games.
I've actually played that. I've played a lot of the Telltale game because it was on Games with Gold a few months back.
Yep, obviously other games are available.
Other games available, yeah.
But it's a great sort of little end to the story that, yes, she did try to come back. And the film was a major it received, like I say, it received mixed reviews from critics, and it grossed a similar box office return of $336 million against a far more improved budget of $40 million.
Yeah, and with this one, we also have the impetus of knowing that there would be a part 3 because they filmed it back to back, and the way they set up part 3 is fantastic. We see the lightning strike again from the future estate where Marty would live. The almanac is burned. Doc's in the DeLorean ready to go back to 85. Marty's about to get in, but then the lightning strike happens. Doc's gone.
And Doc's gone, and we don't know what's happened until
Western Union man comes in.
The Western Union man comes in, delivers a handwritten letter to Marty from Doc, who has revealed that he has been transported to 1885, in the time of the Wild West. And he has been instructed by Doc not to come back for him. Doc is happy in his new life. And Marty's normally okay with that until he discovers a grave that belongs to Doc Brown in the cemetery.
As they find the DeLorean that they're out to sort of send him back.
Indeed, meaning that Doc is indeed in a lot of trouble. Now, when Marty goes back to Doc Emmett Brown has a sort of a heart attack, faints because he thinks that Marty's gone back to the future and he can't deal with it. I like the thing is, though, I don't think that was looked at very closely in part 2. It was just seen as him fainting. In the novels, they really expand on that and say that actually, if he dies, then that means everything goes down the tubes. Which is really, really interesting. But there you go. But Marty revives Doc, and and Marty goes back to 1885 wearing some ridiculous duds.
Well, what he thinks to be a so-called cowboy in 1980s speak, which he realises isn't what it's actually like.
Indeed. And there he travels back to 1885. He finds he's knocked out by a bear. Don't ask.
Yeah.
And he's found, and he is found by his Irish-born great-grandparents, Seamus and Maggie McFly. And again, we get to learn a little bit more about Marty's family history and these two important people. And then he walks to Hill Valley and runs afoul of Buford.
Buford Mad Dog Tannen.
Buford Tannen, Bill Tannen's ancestor. And the Doc manages to save Marty, but there is an issue. As Marty reveals to Doc his fate, Marty also reveals that during the one of his adventures after being knocked out by a bear, that the DeLorean was hit by an arrow and it ruptured the fuel tank, which means that they have no gas to get home. And so they decide that they have to build a machine out of a locomotive. So they have to push the DeLorean using the locomotive to get it 88 miles per hour. And the rest of the film happens. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
It is one of the best prequels ever.
Yeah, because it does a lot in terms of the backstory as well, because we not only do we get the closure for the Marty Doc story, we also get, for the very first time, the Doc has a love interest. Mary Steenburgen came on board for this film, and she only did this film because her kids really wanted her to be in a Back to the Future movie. And she comes on board as Clara, which was, and he said it in the commentary, Christopher Lloyd's first on-screen snog.
Yep.
That's the level of commitment these people went to make Part 3 such a good film.
Yep, it's brilliant. Now, the origins of the Wild West in the actually lie with Michael J. Fox, believe it or not.
Yeah.
During the filming for the original, Zemeckis asked Michael J. Fox, what time period he would want to see. And Fox said, well, if I had a time machine, I'd want to visit the Old West and meet the cowboys. Same here, actually, because I'm a massive fan of the American Wild West. And this sort of inspired Zemeckis, and they thought, well, actually, how cool would it be if Marty went back to the Wild West of in his town of Hill Valley? And they held out for it. They held off it until Part 3. And it is brilliant. It turns out it is fantastic. The set design is quintessential Wild West town.
Yep.
The costumes are fantastic. The set design in these movies for Hill Valley and is just, it's next level.
Yeah.
For its time. It really is.
Because it doesn't feel like it's all shot on a backlot. It really doesn't feel like it's all shot on a backlot. The way they were able to put all three films together, the 2015 stuff was ahead of its time, well, partly because they had Industrial Light and Magic working on visual effects, and ILM have been like the purveyor of visual effects within Hollywood since 1977 and Star Wars happening. So they've had the best VFX artists working on this movie, but the whole Western stuff, focusing more on that in-camera stuff, they made that desert version of Hill Valley. You could still recognise it, even though none of the buildings that you know from the 55 or the 85 versions are there. The clock tower is there, and one of the key plot points is the clock actually being activated and that iconic picture being taken.
Yeah, the picture of Doc and Marty in front of the clock, which is a lovely little piece of iconography from the third movie. But again, we also get to see characters that we all sort of recognise. We see Biff Tannen's ancestor, Buford Mad Dog Tannen, played by Thomas F. Wilson, who also plays Biff Tannen. That's a thing. They get these people back. Maggie McFly is played by Leah Thompson, who plays Lorraine Baines McFly, Marty's mum. Again, I don't think we let's have a quick here and see.
I don't remember Crispin Glover being involved aside from the ending.
Seamus McFly is being portrayed
Fox,
by Michael J. Fox this time. So we still get to see some of the characters being portrayed by, the original actors, and it was released 6 months after the previous installment as well. That's unheard of.
That's like Infinity War coming out in December and Endgame coming out in April. It's just unheard of.
Yep, and it was a noted improvement over its predecessor. Critics loved it.
Yeah,
they really did. It's and what makes this trilogy so great is that it's just one elongated story.
Yes, indeed.
I go back to what I said earlier in that, yes, all right, having Marty's girlfriend finish her story in the car and then flying off was a bit of an inconvenience because they then had to come up with the reason as to, they had to come up with the continuing on with the adventure instead of starting a whole new day.
That might explain why she's asleep for half of the film. Yeah.
However, it still works. It's one long adventure. It's an epic science fiction tale. It's brilliant, and and the ending to Back to the Future 3 as well.
Oh, what an ending!
You could not have written that any better. It is. Yeah, I mean, I'll let you do it, Jack. Go on.
So, the ending of Back to the Future Part 3, after successfully getting a time train over what would eventually become known as the Eastwood Ravine, little callback to a fight between Buford and Marty towards the end of the film, which again is a callback to Biff watching a Clint Eastwood film in his Pleasure Palace in Part 2, with the whole, I'm actually wearing bullet armour. So Marty had saloon door on his chest to prevent being killed. Again, changing the events of the film. So, time train successfully gets back to 85 Hill Valley. We think all is well. Level crossing starts doing its thing. The DeLorean is destroyed. That's it. No more travelling. He goes to see Jennifer, waking up after the events of Part 2, claiming that she had a horrible nightmare about the future. They then travel down to the site where the DeLorean was destroyed. Well, before that, they encounter the incident in which the Rolls-Royce incident that was referred to in Part 2, preventing the events that would get Marty sacked from his job. Nice callback there. Subtle. One for the die-hard fans. That's when the "you're fired" fax disappears.
Yeah, and it's a brilliant example of character development where Marty has finally learned that if someone calls him chicken, he doesn't have to rise to the bait. And it's this character development that he's learned over these 3 movies that prevents him from making a horrifying mistake involving a car crash, a lawsuit, and his crippled future. And the fax machine message that dictates the future that Jennifer has been holding on to is erased. It is now just a blank piece of paper. And then as they go to the crash site of the DeLorean, there is that triple sonic boom, easily recognizable, and a steam locomotive flying out of the sky comes along equipped with a flux capacitor, manned, of course, by Doc Brown.
And his now wife, Clara.
His wife Clara and their 2 children, Jules and Vern, and they reveal that all is well, safe, all is well. They're going to live happily ever after. And Doc reveals, after Jennifer asks about the facts, that it means the future hasn't been written yet.
The future is whatever you make it.
So make it a good one. And everyone says goodbye, and they depart. And yeah, so endeth one of the best trilogies ever.
Now,
like I say, it's such a great trilogy that the director has basically refused to let remakes happen.
Yep, he's basically said no to remakes. As long as me and Bob Gale are alive, I'm not going to authorise any remakes because you do not mess with that. Although one thing about that ending, and one of my Journal executive producers pointed this out, and he actually ruined this ending for what I think is a perfect ending. So, Ed Greenberg, you are a git for telling me this. He pointed out something I can't not see. So during that final moment where we get introduced to Jules and Vern, one of the boys decides on camera during a very take that they'd use to actually scratch his balls. And they use that take.
Jesus.
And if it wasn't for Ed Greenberg mentioning that moment to me, I would have still held that film. I still hold that film well, but I wouldn't have enjoyed it as well. I enjoyed it less after he pointed it out. Yeah, honestly.
Things, isn't it?
I'm going to be speaking with him on Friday about it as well.
Did you really have to say that? But no, it is a fantastic, brilliant trilogy. And it's, again, trilogies are really, really hard to do because, what adventure can you have? You've got to get people invested in that character for 3 whole movies over a long period of time. And it worked. Back to the Future is one of the best trilogies in cinema history.
Yep.
Like, no doubt about it, because it has characters, they grow, it has a brilliant time travel plot that is very... It's complex when you think about it, but when you watch it, it's not. They make it so simple and easy to follow. And it has so many amazing moments and so many jokes that occur over and over again. One of my biggest regrets is there was Back to the Future Day in 2015, where they had Back to the Future, the whole trilogy, back to front in my local cinema, and I didn't go.
My local had it. I got to see part 1 in cinema in 2010 for the 25th, and I had the Blu-ray for the Back to the Future Day itself, and I watched the trilogy on Back to the Future Day. But seeing it on a big screen where it was designed to be watched, that was a real bucket list experience for a franchise that has spawned a lot. An animated series, couple of rides at Universal Studios in Orlando, Hollywood, and Japan, which have closed in the years. The ones in Hollywood and Orlando were replaced with a Simpsons ride, God help us. The Japanese one was replaced by Despicable Me, Minion Mayhem. And it even spawned... It's quite timely because it's the anniversary of it opening pretty soon. Last year, Back to the Future the Musical opened in Manchester. Unfortunately, it only managed 2 weeks before the lockdown kicked in. But a musical does exist based on the first film. Zemeckis and Gale were involved. Alan Silvestri wrote the music for it. So they're finding more and more ways to not remake it per se, but to tell the story of the original in new ways that can get new audiences engaged with the brilliant original movie.
Yeah, and it's smart. It's such a smart thing to do, isn't it? Just create a musical. If you can't create a remake of the film, just redo the film in musical format. I'm really, really glad that the director allowed that to happen. Because, like you say, it introduces people to this brilliant movie, but it's people who wouldn't normally go see Back to the Future. They're more musical lovers. And they watch this and they're like, wow, this is brilliant. I have to watch this movie now and see what happens. And they're introduced to this brilliant trilogy.
Yeah, and importantly, the spirit of the original is there as well, because Power of Love is one of the songs, Back in Time is one of the songs, and like I say, Silvestri wrote the score for it. So it's got all the hallmarks of the original, and everyone was involved. It's just a shame that it'd been in production for about 5 years. I started working on it in 2015. It's just a shame it opened weeks before COVID came into our lives.
Well, yeah. Ho-hum.
Well, we know for a fact it's going to be opening in London once restrictions are eased. So it's got a West End home. And for the musical theatre nerds, that is a good thing, because that is a captive audience right there.
Definitely. Hopefully, when life returns to whatever normalcy is going to be, we can all go back and watch this one day. But Back to the Future, cut, wrap, print, send to press.
Yeah, literally wrote that line into my script as well. I'm getting good at writing these podcasts now.
There we go. And next week, we're talking about another trilogy, because that was your favourite trilogy, isn't it? I think it's Back to the Future.
It is, yes. It is my absolute favourite trilogy.
My favourite trilogy is a very personal choice for me, because it's a trilogy that helped to introduce fantasy to the masses, what has been in the past downgraded to a genre that only nerds like and geeks was suddenly cool again, thanks to Peter Jackson. It is, of course, The Lord of the Rings, which I'm watching today, and it's brilliant.
No. I love the fact that all of the films that we've picked, with the exception of RoboCop, for this podcast so far, were on the big list that cinemas got for reopening last year.
I know. Because
the local cinema, on the week that they reopened, they did the whole Lord of the Rings extended trilogy over one day, and they had it was a socially distant sellout. Surprise, surprise.
Brilliant. But yeah, we'll be talking about Lord of the Rings, the trilogy, and it's going to be a very personal episode for me. Definitely.
Oh yeah, it wouldn't be a series of Rip Ticket without one or two personal episodes along the way. That is it. That is basically it for this week. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, stay tuned to social media for the details exactly when we're going to be live next week. We always like to confirm that ahead of when we're on air. If you're listening on iTunes, Spotify, or any of the podcast platforms, why are you not watching live every week? Because it's the best experience of the lot. We are live on Facebook and YouTube every week at some point from 3 p.m. UK time. It varies week on week, depending on our availability. On top of that, we have we've got a whole series worth. If you're new to the podcast, we have an 8-episode series one that we did during Lockdown 1, covering themes like The Room, The Crow, Edgar Wright series Spaced, Alien, superhero films within cinema, and just for the restart last year, we did a whole episode on Christopher Nolan films. Of course, next week we're looking at. It's hard not to say another one of the greatest trilogies of all time, with Lord of the Rings. It's going to be a good episode. It's going to be another cracking episode. I can feel it. So we will be back at some point next week with more Ripped Ticket review goodness. Until then, my name's been TheJackSmit.
I've been Dan Carver.
Until next week, we'll see you at the movies. Take it easy, everyone, and remember, roadmaps aren't definite. Films are. We'll see you at the movies.
Bye.